Good morning. Good to see everybody here today. I want to begin by telling you how I decided to talk about the lesson that we want to talk about today. One day this past week, my mom came over to, I always want to say our house, but we don't really have a house. My mom came over to our camper where we're currently living and said that she wanted to show us something. And she had a pamphlet, and she had purchased a tombstone for her and my dad, and she wanted to go ahead and take care of some funeral arrangement things so that we wouldn't have to worry about it. And that's really odd, when you have somebody with a pamphlet and it's like this is top of the line stuff here. This is the motto I got. But we know and we're sure that life isn't going to last forever, and so it's part of life. Maybe some of you have done that, made preparations for what you want done whenever you pass from this life. And so in thinking about that, I really wanted to spend some time talking about that. And I found this picture on the internet. I think it's supposed to say, I'm everyone. You got a birth date, you got a death date, and your life is the dash. The sum of our life after we leave this earth on a tombstone is reduced down to a dash in between two dates. A day that we were born, a day that we die, and a dash representing what our lives were upon the earth. Our entire life just reduced between two dates and a dash. We don't get to decide the dates, we didn't decide the date that we were born, and we don't decide the date that we pass from this life. But it doesn't really make any real difference on the date that we were born or the date that we die. What makes the difference is how we lived. And so I want to spend some time this morning talking about living the dash, how we lived the dash between the dates. And so that's what we titled the lesson this morning. And so we'll just spend some time talking about that. Just contemplating life, contemplating that little dash in between two dates that will represent our life after we pass from this life. If you're like me, if you watched the news this past week, it's been talked about the assassination attempt on our former President Donald Trump, and there's been so much talked about that. And he was close from not continuing on living. I mean, if a head tilt away, life is something that's fragile. At times we kind of take it for granted. Like I've been here, I'll just continue being here, but that's not necessarily so. And so just some quick thoughts, I think, about living the dash between the dates. And hopefully that'll be beneficial for us, because the goal is, we know we're not going to live forever. The goal is to make it to heaven. I was telling Kristen this morning that there was hardly any cars on the road. And I was just telling her, if we weren't trying to go to heaven, I guess we would just stay at home. And that's what a lot of people do. But we know it's important to be here. We know it's important because we're working toward the goal of heaven, and we want to please God. And as we worship Him today, let's consider our life and what He's got planned for our life. In the first place, in this idea about living the dash between the dates, a really simple observation is that life is short. I know that you know that. We've talked about that a lot. I want to take a look at, though, how the Bible compares life to a flower. Every once in a while we sing that song, as a flower, our lives will fade away and pass away. And the Bible does use that comparison, and I think it helps kind of paint a picture for us to what life is like. In the reading that was done for us in Psalm 103, beginning of verse 15, it says, "As for man, his days are like grass, as a flower of the field, so he flourishes. For the wind passes over it, and it is gone, and its place remembers it no more." All right, so look at our lives compared to a flower. Man's life cycle is found in these two verses, these two short verses. As a flower, we've kind of got our moment in the sun. As a flower of the field, we flourish, and we're there for a little time. And then the wind passes over it. Time passes us by, kind of like the wind, and then we die. And then we go on, and our place in life is remembered no more. We're soon forgotten. That's kind of sad. I mean, if you just stop to think about that, I mean, I'm here now, gone tomorrow, and I'll be quickly forgotten. Flowers bloom just a short period of time, and then seasons change, and they're no longer blooming. That's the reality of the situation. Our days are like a flower of the field. It's there for a time and then gone shortly thereafter. In Isaiah's day, in Isaiah 40, beginning at verse 6, not really diving to the context a whole lot, but in Isaiah 40 it says, "The voice said, 'Cry out,' and he said, 'What shall I cry? All flesh is grass, all its loveliness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, because the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever.'" Again, here I think the idea is kind of mentioned. There's an understanding of the shortness of life. You're going to be there for a little time. And there's some good parts to it. All its loveliness is like the flower of the field. That's good, but the flower's going to fade. And people are like grass. The grass withers, the flower fades. It's not going to last forever. In James 4 and verse 14, very, very familiar verse, James said, "Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away." Life is like a vapor. We've got a little time. Death can occur at any time. It could be that our life ends slow and naturally. It could be quick and traumatically. Old age might take us. We just don't know. But James says, what is your life? Kind of an interesting question. What is your life? 100 years from now, what will represent you on this earth? Maybe there's some things that I'll have that'll be left behind. Maybe I've got some descendants, some kids, maybe, who knows, grandkids or great-grandkids, to sort of represent my family line. But the only thing that'll really represent me is that dash between the dates. If somebody goes and visits the place where I'm buried, it'll have a date that I was born and a date that I died, and then just a little dash that represents my whole existence upon this earth. What is your life? It's just a very short period of time. And James points that out here. The phrase, he says, it appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Again, that short little dash representing our lives. And so think about that. People may go and view your headstone and maybe tell stories about they remember you and some things that you've done, some things that you believed in, some things you stood up for. And all that's going to represent you is that short little dash. And I think really it should cause us to be sober about our own life and sober about mortality. I think maybe older people are more in touch with it and young people are not, and feel like we're just going to be here forever. But life isn't, and death isn't a respecter of persons. People young and old die alike. That's part of living. I'm sure that people that wake up a day and have a car accident and it takes their life, they didn't wake up that morning and say, you know what, I think I'll probably die today. I'm sure they didn't have that thought. It probably never crossed their mind, but it still happened just the same. And so life ends very traumatically. Hopefully and thankfully that doesn't happen all the time, but we do know life is short regardless. In James 1, beginning at verse 9, it says, "Let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, but the rich in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field he will pass away. For no sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat than it withers the grass. Its flower falls and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits." Now James was really talking to those that are rich and kind of comparing that to how it is really just a vain thing to get caught up in riches. The rich man will also fade away in his pursuits. But the point is the same. The sun will rise with burning heat and it'll wither the grass. Its flower falls and the beautiful appearance perishes. Life is just short. I mean, for a short period of time, it's there and it's alive as it's ever been and ever will be, and then it'll pass away. Life is short. And so the first thing we got to say about living the dash between the dates is it's not going to last very long. And the Bible compares life to like a flower, and I think that's an interesting word picture. The second thing that I think we can say is sin is included there. Maybe that's something ugly that we really don't want to talk about. When you go and you look at a tombstone and you see a birth date and a death date in that dash, you don't really maybe think about that. But in everybody's life, sin is included. And so in that dash that we're living, sin is included there. And that's kind of a negative aspect of it, but it's a reality just the same. In Genesis 3, verse 6, beginning, you know the story. Adam and Eve, they were tempted by the serpent to eat of the tree that God commanded them not to eat of. We know that story. Verse 6 says, "When the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked." Verse 13, the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" So God actually, talked to Adam and asked him what you do. And remember Adam, well, the woman you gave to be with me, she gave me and I ate. And then he talked to Eve. Eve blamed the serpent, of course, and God dealt out consequences to all of them. But I just thought it was interesting in rereading through that God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" God knew what they had done. It wasn't a question, "I'm not sure what they've done. Let me ask, what have you done?" This was more of a question of just disappointment from God. What have you done? And it's almost like a parent to a child that's made some kind of mistake or made some kind of mess. What are you doing? What have you done? And God asked that question of them because He had told them not to eat of it. He had told them the consequences, and they did it anyway. I think we may read that and think, "Man, how foolish were they? Just foolish they were, and how could they do that to God?" Well, if we're thinking along those lines, we probably need to bring it closer to home, because this is a path that we've all been down. We've all been down the path where God has told us to do some things and not to do some things, and we've all made the decision to disobey God at one point or another. And so you can imagine God being disappointed and having the thought, "What have you done? What is this that you have done?" So from this time on, in Genesis 3 till now, every person that has ever lived besides Jesus has chosen to disobey God. That includes all of us here this morning. That's just a fact. We've all done that. And so in our dash that we're living, sin is included there. That's kind of an ugly part of it, but it still remains the same. We've all chosen to disobey God. Romans 3:23 speaks to that, where it says all have sinned. In James 1, verse 14, James describes the course of temptation. You know, how it works, how it leads to sin. It says, "Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Be not deceived, my beloved brethren." James describes the course of temptation leading to sin. This is, again, path we've all been on. So it's not like James is talking to other people, not me. This is true of all of us. So we've been tempted with something, whatever it is. It's different for everybody. We're drawn away by our own desires and enticed. And then when we give in to that, he describes it as like the birth process. When desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. So you got a desire, you put action toward that desire, you act on it, and then it gives birth to sin. Well, and then that brings forth death. Again, a path that we've all been on. Now, this isn't talking about physical death. This is talking about spiritual death. When we get involved in sin, we separate ourselves from God. And so that is part of the dash of life. It's not all just sunshine and rainbows. There's struggles, there's difficulties that make up our lives. And so sin is included in that dash. Thirdly, I would say that choices must be made on this dash between the dates that we are living. We've got to make some choices. We just have to. And the choices I've got in mind aren't, what I'm going to eat for lunch, or, where I'm going to work, or where we're going to live. I mean, those are choices that we have to make. And there's a time and place to make those. But here we want to talk about spiritual choices. We've got to make some choices in this dash that we're living. In Matthew 13, this is so Jesus told the parable of the sower, and then he kind of retold it with an explanation. This is the explanation piece in Matthew 13, beginning at verse 18. It says, "When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arises on the account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields," and the text goes on. So again, explanation of the parable of the sower. I really want to draw your attention to the rocky ground. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word, immediately receives it with joy. He's got no root in himself, endures for a while, it says, but when tribulation and persecution arises, immediately he falls away. So that's the rocky ground. I think the point I'm just trying to make here is tribulation and persecution at some level is going to happen, and those on the rocky ground just couldn't deal with it. It was all good there for a little bit, but then there was some trouble, there was some struggle, and so the person that's described here falls away. All of us are going to have to deal with struggles. We're going to have to make choices. And you can't just make it one time and say, I'm going to be a Christian today, and then not make that decision going forward. You'll fall away. You'll be like a person on the rocky ground. So you got to make that decision, but you got to continue making it. Choices have to be made while you're living this dash. In James 1, in verse 12, back to the book of James, he said, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." And so remaining steadfast under trial and standing the test. If you stand the test, then you'll receive a crown of life. And so that to me tells me that we got to make choices, every day. We got to make a choice every day. You going to serve God today, or are you not? Choice we got to make. We got to get up knowing what our decision's going to be. But we've got to remain steadfast under trial. I'm not a boxing fan, but I always appreciate that quote that Mike Tyson gave. Mike Tyson was a great boxer, I guess by all accounts, and he was going to fight Evander Holyfield. And they asked him, he was being interviewed, and they said, "What are you going to do with Evander Holyfield's plan to defeat you?" And Mike Tyson said, "Well, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth." And it's true. Everybody's got a plan, and everybody sounds tough when you're sitting around talking about it in comfort. But when you get into the battle, how many will tuck tail and run at that time? And so James is saying, if you remain steadfast, if you stand the test, then you'll receive the crown of life. That's easy for us right now to sit here and talk about that. We're in a comfortable building. We're all on the, we have like mind here. We have like precious faith. And so it's easy for us to sit here and talk about it. Yes, we will be strong. But the test will be when the rubber meets the road, when we go to work or we go to school or we deal with people. Are we going to remain steadfast? That's the test. If we do that, then we can receive the crown of life. Paul, at the end of his life, in 2 Timothy 4, verse 6, just two or three really familiar verses here. Paul said, "I am ready, or already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." Paul knew he was at the end of life. He says, the time of my departure has come. So Paul has faithfully served God. He knew he is finishing up his assignment on this earth. I just want to ask you, do you think Paul, at the end of his life here, do you think he thought, I should have taken more time for myself? I was reflecting on vacations that I had taken, and I don't think I've taken enough time for myself. I don't think those thoughts were going through Paul's mind. He had served God faithfully, and he had, we talk often about all the things that Paul suffered for the cause of Christ. And when the end of life comes, the most important thing, it's nice to take vacation. If you need to take a vacation, take a vacation. But the most important thing at the end of life isn't worldly things like that. It isn't what things that I've done here. The most important thing at the end of Paul's life was, he mentions it here, I have fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith. That's all that mattered at that point. Nothing else mattered at that point. It doesn't matter, what Paul's living situation looked like. Did he have nice possessions? None of that stuff mattered at the end of his life. What mattered is that he had kept the faith. And so he says, because he had kept the faith, there's a crown of righteousness laid up for him. And he had confidence that not to him only, but all who have loved his appearing. So that would include us. If we keep the faith, if we can have that same mindset as Paul, then we can also know that the Lord, the righteous judge, will award us on that day if we're living faithfully. That's a beautiful passage. A lot of times that passage is read at funerals because it's so appropriate. Paul knew it was at the end of his life. He knew that all that mattered at that time was the faith he had in God. He was devoted to serving God. But Paul had choices to make. And we've talked in the Wednesday night class about Paul, being stoned. He could have just quit. This isn't working out for me. But he made choices. He made the choice to serve God. And so all that mattered was his faith in God at the very end. Fourthly, I think we can say most of life will be mundane. I spent some time talking about this. I don't know if that's the best way to phrase that. Mundane just means ordinary, just kind of routine. Most of our life is gonna kind of be boring routine. Have you ever thought about that? Have you put time into that? I spent some time thinking about that. events happen in our lives that we call defining moments, maybe. There's some big things. If you look back over your life, there's probably some defining high points in your life that you can look back and say, yeah, that instance there put me on the path toward my career, or that conversation there put me on the path to becoming a Christian. I really thought about obeying the gospel after having that lesson presented. Something along those lines. A defining moment defined when I wanted to marry my spouse. You look back on your life and you think about those defining moments. When we have to make hard choices, and that kind of defines who we are. There's times where people show moments of courage and save somebody's life, or a moment of conviction and they stand up for God, or they face some challenge. And that is true. We do have moments like that in life. But our whole life, thankfully, isn't just one challenge after another. There's a lot of downtime and boring routine in between. And so most of our life will be mundane. And I don't know if you spent much time thinking about that, but it's true. The example that I'll give you is Abraham. We know a lot about Abraham. We read a lot about him in the Old Testament. He lived 175 years. So that's a long time. Out of all those years, though, we only have a handful of events that occurred in his life. And we just don't know every single thing that he did. And so maybe the question comes up, what did he do in all his downtime? Now, we know what he did during challenging times. We read about Abraham and Isaac. We read about a bunch of things in life where God made him promises and how he reacted to that. But if you add all of the things up that we know about Abraham, we actually know only a few details about his life over a short period of time, not everything he ever did. So how did Abraham live in the gaps, the things that we don't know about? I think we have some clues. I think the Bible shows that to us. And I got 3 verses I'll read to you here. In Genesis 12 and verse 8, it says, he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel. He pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. What did Abraham do in the ordinary, the routine, the mundane, whenever there wasn't something big going on? I would just submit to you, I think we can draw from this that he worshiped God. I mean, he served God even during the ordinary. And he did when times were difficult, but his general practice was to serve and worship God. In Genesis 13 and verse 18, it says, then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. You see him worshiping God. In Genesis 21 verse 33, then Abram planted a terebinth tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. So what did Abraham do in his downtime? What's what he always did? He served God. He worshiped God. He had God in mind in his life. And so there's some times where, you think, man, I'm just doing just routine stuff. I'm getting up and going to work, and this isn't really that special. When the end of my life is said and done, nobody's going to say, yeah, on Monday morning at 5 o'clock, he woke up and went to work. That's kind of boring stuff, but we have to do that. But the overall picture is God is in mind, and we are serving God all throughout that. And I just use Abraham as an example. There's other examples in the Bible. But those things that Abraham did during the ordinary, the routine, that defined him as a man of faith. Because when the defining moments came, he served God because he'd always served God. His routine was to do that. He believed in God. He put his faith and trust in God. And so we should as well. What we do with the time that we have, even during downtime or however you want to call it, calm time in our lives, that defines who we are. A lot of it's going to be mundane. A lot of it's just going to be ordinary routine. But what we do during those times really defines who we are. That's part of living the dash between the dates. The fifth thing and the last thing we'll say is, the dash won't last forever. The dash just won't last forever. The dash won't last forever. It's obviously pretty short on a tombstone. There's limited space there, but our lives are short, and we talked about that. But here I'm not really talking about length, just talking about looking forward to needing our life to be right before it's over. Unless we are alive when the Lord returns, all of us will die. And that's a fact. That's not something that we want to talk about often or maybe think about, but it's just a reality of the situation. So many people aren't at all ready for that or don't even want to have that conversation. But it's something that we have to face. The dash won't last forever. In Hebrews 9 and verse 27, The Hebrew writer says, and as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this, the judgment. That's an appointment that's already been set, already been made. God determined it, and there's nothing I'm going to be able to do to get around it. I will die, and then I will stand before God in judgment, and so will you. We all will. So will everybody that's lived upon the earth. There's a lot of people alive today, but all of them will be there on the day of judgment. It's kind of hard to comprehend what that scene will look like, but we know it's so. All will face that final judgment. That is just another fact. And so the dash between the dates that we've been talking about is all that's going to count when we stand before God. We're going to be judged by the virtue of how we lived. How we lived that dash. Some people have short lives. You know, if you've ever been to a cemetery and you look and you say, well, that person lived a very short life. And some people live long times. And we think, man, they lived a long life. We don't know how long the dash will be, but we do know that what God looks at is not the day that we're born necessarily and the date that we die, but He looks at how we lived. And that's what's important to God. And so we're living the dash, live knowing that judgment is coming because we have an appointment made for us that we will pass from this life. In Matthew 25, verse 41, just real quickly want to say, you know, we don't want to hear the Lord saying to us on the day of judgment, like is said here, say to those on the left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. That's not the message we want to receive on the day of judgment. And so how we're living is what counts. In Ecclesiastes 1, you know, we know the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon was very wise. He talked about how all is vanity. There's a bunch of verses maybe we could have picked out, but I just chose the first 4 of the book. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. You know, Solomon just observed that, you know, we're doing all this stuff. We're busy, we're working, we're trying to build a living for ourselves. One generation passes away, another one comes, and the earth just keeps on going. And so it's all vanity. If I spend my whole life caught up in the here and now, then how sad is that? Because it's all passing away. It's all vain. Not going to mean anything in the very end. At the end of the book, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14, the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep His commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. And so, for our lesson purposes today, I think we can say that what Solomon said was, how you live that dash is important. At the end of the day, how you live is important, because at the end you're going to have to answer for how you lived. Every act will be brought into judgment. And so, you ought to fear God and keep His commandments, knowing that. And so hopefully we don't take the dash for granted, because it does represent the days of our lives. We will say, though, as we're kind of bringing our lesson to a close, we've got to understand that it's never too late to change your life. It's never too late to change that dash. Maybe up to this point, the dash representing your life has been one of selfishness, one of ungodliness. You can change that, and you can change that today. You can give your life to God. You can obey the gospel today, and then you can change the overall tone or the overall message of your life and what your dash represents. It's never too late to change while you're alive on this earth. I want to read a quick poem. I found a poem called "The Dash" by Linda Ellis, and I want to read that before we bring the lesson to a close. The poem says, I read of a man who stood to speak at a funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted first came the date of birth and spoke the following date with tears, but he said what mattered most of all was the dash between the years. For that dash represents all the time they spent life on earth, and now only those who love them know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love and how we spend our dash. So think about this long and hard. Are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that can still be rearranged. If we could just slow down enough to consider what's true and real and always try to understand the way other people feel, be less quick to anger and show appreciation more, and love the people in our lives like we've never loved before. If we treat each other with respect and more often wear a smile, remembering that this special dash might only last a little while. So, when your eulogy is being read with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they say about how you spent your dash? I thought that was fitting. So as we consider our lives and know that it's going to be short, we know that there's sin involved there. We know that we've got to choose to serve and love God. Even during the routine and the mundane, it's not going to last forever. And so the question is, are you right with God? Is your soul right with God? If your dash were to end today, do you know where you'd be spending eternity? Sobering question to ask. If you haven't obeyed the gospel, the truth is you can't look forward to going to heaven. And so if you hadn't obeyed the gospel, you got to do that. And we'd be glad to help you do that. If you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, you know that He came and died for your sins. If you believe that, if you're willing to repent of your sins, confess your faith, and you're willing to be baptized, then we'd just be happy to baptize you into Christ today. I mean, we couldn't be more excited to do that. The angels in heaven would rejoice with you if you give your life to God and obey the gospel. Or maybe you're here today and you know that, man, I've been living life and I just hadn't been doing good. I hadn't been living the way that God has wanted me to live. And so, if somebody were talking about me and my dash of life, it's not a real good story right now because I haven't been living for God. Well, you got time to change that. You can change it today because your dash won't last forever. Life is short. And so if you need to make your life right, I just beg you to consider that. Beg you to make your life right. We want to leave here knowing we're in a good standing with God today. If you have a need of any spiritual way that we can help with, come forward while we stand and while we sing this song of invitation.